President Trump's personal attorney sounding off on the first indictments by special counsel Robert Mueller and the guilty plea by former Trump campaign advisor George Papadopoulos. He says it all adds up to nothing special. Listen.
You just had all this conversation about collusion. Remember this, collusion in and of itself, there's no crime of collusion. What is a violation of the law here? I go back to that. For George Papadopoulos, the violation of the law, George, was that he lied to FBI agents, which is clearly not condoned by the administration.
Kent Zimmerman is a former general counsel and contributor to the National Law Journal. Stephen Mulroy is a law professor at the University of Memphis and a former federal prosecutor. Thanks, both of you, for being here. Stephen, I want to start with you because there was an unusual 1-2 nature of what was unsealed yesterday by Robert Mueller's team. First, there are the charges against Gates and Manafort, who clearly worked for the campaign, and they have nothing to do with the campaign. Then comes the unsealing of the revelation, frankly, that a campaign volunteer had pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI, and people say, oh, Mueller's really smart here because what he did shows that this does tie the campaign to, Russia activity. But is that what the special counsel is supposed to be doing? Just give us your assessment on that.
Right. Well, I mean, clearly the Papadopoulos plea, I think, is the more significant of the two, if we're really just talking about collusion itself, because there are some statements in the guilty plea in which Papadopoulos says that he was in active contact with Russian people, expecting to get some sort of dirt on Hillary Clinton, hacked emails, and this is his claim anyway. That at least speaks to collusion. Now, there's no proof that President Trump actually knew anything about that personally, but at least it's in that ballpark. The indictments for Manafort and Gates don't really speak to collusion at all, but I think Mueller here is playing the long game. The idea is if he can have leverage over Manafort and Gates because of other legal violations, tax evasion, the failure to report the fact that they were lobbyists, and most significantly lying to federal investigators about it, well, then he can use that leverage to get them to talk about collusion. And I think we're just seeing the first opening salvos in probably a much longer process.
Yeah, but Kent, there are some legal observers. I talked to a former federal prosecutor who said nothing that what Manafort and Gates have been charged with has anything to do with what Robert Mueller was charged with in his investigation.
Well, that may be factually accurate, John, but the way that federal investigations like this usually work is that they look to squeeze lower-level people on violations that may be unrelated in order to get them to cooperate with the government and prosecute people higher up on the ladder. And so it's not so relevant whether or not what they're charged with is related to collusion. What's relevant, as has been noted, is whether they're going to be pressured into cooperating with the government. And as they already have Papadopoulos cooperating, he pled guilty on October 5th, that sends a message to others, including Manafort and Gates, including others who haven't yet been charged, that if you cooperate with the government, you can get off easy and avoid a long jail term. If you don't, you could be in trouble. And that probably has many people in Trump's orbit thinking about whether or not they should cooperate to avoid jail time.
But, Stephen, a lot of observers have looked at what is revealed in the guilty plea against Papadopoulos and said, look, having a conversation even with, a Russian professor about digging up dirt on Hillary Clinton, that is not illegal. What was illegal about what he did is lying to the FBI about it, apparently.
Right. So, John, there's an old expression about we got Al Capone on taxes, and I think that's at work here as well. What they're going to do is they're going to go after Manafort and Gates on things that are clearly provable, like the failure to register as foreign lobbyists and hiding their accounts offshore, and then work from there. The other cliche you often hear is that it's not the crime, it's the cover-up, and that's in evidence here, too. Both Papadopoulos and Manafort and Gates are alleged to have lied to federal authorities about the investigation, and that's a whole separate crime, 18 U.S.C. 1001, which carries its own penalties. So even though these things may not be smoking gun evidence of actual collusion, they're the kind of thing that could lead to such evidence later on, just like in any other investigation of organized crime or drug, conspiracy or anything like that. It just moves the ball down the field to eventually getting perhaps some more information that directly ties somebody higher up in the campaign to collusion. Well, now, I think you're right. There's no legal crime as collusion,
Go
right?
ahead,
So
Ken.
there's no legal crime of collusion, but it's the kind of thing that Congress might consider an impeachable offense at some point down the road, depending on what we find out.
Well,
If you
but
look at the
but
very
again,
prosecutors,
go ahead, Ken.
if you look at the very prosecutors on Mueller's team, they dozens of times have used this exact same strategy in prosecuting everything from the mafia and organized crime to taking down Enron. They start with people with unrelated alleged criminal violations, and then they work their way up and use them to cooperate as leverage. And I think that's very likely what we're going to see here. And federal prosecutors, they win 94% of the time. They generally don't bring cases they can't win, and that should be of concern too.
All right. Obviously,
right.
other shoes left to drop in this investigation. So
Yes.
far, the White House is professing that it is not worried. Kent Zimmerman, Stephen Mulroy, thank you.
You bet.
Thank you.